What we want to do today is talk about informal learning, and my objective for you is basically just to increase your understanding and application of informal learning, and I'll give you a broad overview. And we'll also talk about how informal learning kind of drives formal learning and vice versa. All right. So an overview quickly, we have some fun facts that I'll go over, then I'll get into informal versus formal learning. We'll talk about the types of informal learning. We'll talk about leveraging informal learning, and then we'll go into a conclusion with a summary and discussion. All right, so let's get started. Consider this picture here. Anybody know who this is? You can go ahead and shout it out. Yeah, Einstein. And so just imagine, I want to study physics. Can I work with you? And somebody says, sorry, you dropped out of high school. Too bad. Okay, next one. Who's this? You can shout it out.
Ed Sheeran.
Okay, can I play music at your event? Sorry, you failed music school. All right. And then we got a last one here. Who are these people? Shout it out. Anybody recognize them?
Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg's on the bottom. Who's on the top? Anybody recognize him? Used to be the richest man in the world.
Bill Gates.
Yeah, Bill Gates. So we want to work with computers. Are you hiring? Sorry, you don't have your degree. Okay, so clearly we're seeing at this point that there's an issue with this. All right, so let's watch this.
I just got invited to give the commencement address at Harvard this year.
That's amazing.
I remember you did it 10 years ago when Priscilla graduated. I was there.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. 30 years later than I was supposed to, but I enjoyed it.
They know we didn't actually graduate, right?
Oh, that is the best part. They actually give you a degree.
You don't even have to go to class?
No, you just put that degree on your resume and it looks great.
Can you help me figure out what I'm going to say?
Yeah, we should work on it together. Let's go get some more snacks.
All right. So you get to wear the hat and everything?
Yeah, you bet. Don't wear anything underneath.
All right, so hopefully you got a little humor out of that. I guess where we're going with this is kind of understanding that formal learning is not the whole story, okay? So a couple things to keep in mind. 70% of students end up taking out loans to go to college, and so that's about $30,000 on average that people take out to go to college. 40% of college students drop out. So 40% just completely drop out. 81% of full-time students don't complete their bachelor's degree on time. 73% of college graduates don't even work in a field that's related to their major. Okay? These are some fairly disturbing statistics. 1 in 8 of the 400 richest billionaires are college dropouts. Okay? And over 90% of self-made millionaires pointed out that they had some sort of a mentor who was able to help them. All right? So up to 90% of learning, depending on the study, is informal. Okay? And so the question is, how does this learning happen without this so-called teaching? That's what we're going to try to dive into today. So let's jump into it, informal versus formal learning. So formal learning, we're probably most familiar with when people talk about learning and education, right? It's basically this idea that we have built this large society over time. It's a complex society that we've developed. And you can't really integrate or assimilate into that society very effectively unless you have some sort of an educational system to kind of get people up to speed. And so if you think about it, back in the day, there really was not an educational system, at least nowhere near as big as it used to be. And then they had like one-room school homes, and we've evolved over time as the need for mass education has come to fruition. All right, so we have this formal educational system usually starts with daycare or pre-K, right? We got the K-12 system. It's basically this educational system that we're talking about, this formal educational system. We have a structured curriculum. We have some sort of an agenda that focuses on some sort of foundational concepts or standards. We have an organized learning environment. Okay, we have a goal or objective. So we have some degree we're working towards, some certificate, diploma. It's often traditional in nature, using this idea of backwards design. So backwards design is something that teachers use, and they say, hey, what is my goal? What is my objective for what I want my students to learn? And then they design their lessons from there. And so they start with the end product. Assessment and grades are usually used to collect and analyze data. And so there's three main forms of assessment. There's assessment that can be done before, during, or after, right, the learning. And there's also another three main forms where we can have assessment for learning, as learning, or of learning. And so formative assessment is for learning. We have metacognitive assessment, which is like your reflections and stuff. That's as learning. And then of learning is summative assessments. We have this happening usually in the classroom. And it's kind of like the cement powder without the water, or some sort of a public bus. So we're all kind of going on this public bus to the same destination, right? So keep that in mind. This is what it kind of looks like, at least in the United States. We have kindergarten, and that starts around age 5. And we have this primary and secondary education with the purpose of getting our high school diploma. So you're all probably pretty familiar with this. And then at that point, we have tertiary education, which kind of kicks in. And so we have some sort of a community college, 4-year university, which you're in right now, or some sort of master's degree after that, or doctoral degree. Obviously, there's other pathways that we're not including here, but that's the gist of what our current educational system looks like in terms of formal education. So that brings us to, what is informal learning then? And so you can kind of see based on the picture, we're searching Google here, searching Wikipedia, searching YouTube, right? What is informal learning? And so informal learning is the stuff that's a little bit more subtle, but remember, up to 90% of your learning is informal, so it's a big deal. Okay, learning is necessary for survival, and every generation usually passes down some sort of knowledge to the next generation. So it started with, let's say, like cave paintings and stories and stuff, and it's evolved into books and all sorts of ways that we can, pass down our skills, values, and traditions over time now. And so it starts prenatally. So before you're even born, before you come out into this world, you're already starting to learn, right? And it happens anytime you have a need, motivation, or opportunity for learning. It occurs in our everyday life through just observation, experimentation, trial, and error. We have peers, social media, YouTube, advisors, networking, self-directed exploration, and so on. We have museums, festivals, storytelling. You got your workplace, books, all sorts of things that we might not think of as learning. Okay, and it can happen without you even thinking about the learning process. So you don't have to be thinking about learning in order to learn. And so that's kind of what makes this informal and a little bit harder to talk about and realize that it's happening. And so it may be unintentional, and it does not have to have a goal. And so as we think about this, we also think about, is there any sort of assessment? Well, it's not always assessment here with informal learning, but there is metacognitive assessment. So remember, metacognitive assessment is the assessment as learning. So it's part of the learning process. So what we mean here is as metacognitive is like you're reflecting on your own experiences, kind of like you do in epics with your reflections. That's some of the main assessment that we're talking about with informal learning. And so it happens outside of the classroom and through play. A lot of people, when they're like, oh, they're just playing, they're not learning. It's not true, okay? There's a lot of learning that can happen through play. And it's like the water for the cement powder, or it's like a personal car. So like you can have a little bit more control over this personal car. You're not on a public bus anymore. All right? So we have this spectrum, this learning formality spectrum that we can kind of look at, and it's really a spectrum. It's not, you can't just look at a learning experience and say, oh, that's informal, or oh, that's formal. Because if you remember with the categorical thinking, that's a bad thing to do. Okay, we naturally define artificial borders to better understand the world, but just recognize that it is a spectrum, right? So we have the spectrum on the left, the informal part, which we don't really have curriculum, not a lot of structure. It's outside the classroom, and then on the right, we do have a bunch of curriculum. It's very structured. We got training events and so on. Okay. So now that we have a better idea of what formal versus informal learning is all about, let's dive in a little bit deeper onto informal learning and talk about the three main types of informal learning. So there's self-directed informal learning, there is incidental, and there's socialization. And so we'll go through each one of these. So the first one is self-directed, and that is basically undertaken by an individual, and you don't really have the assistance of an educator, but you can have this, quote, resource person. 3 examples here: a toddler learning how to put their socks on, cooking with the help of a recipe, that's kind of like the resource person or whatever, learning to ride a bike. Okay, those are some examples of self-directed. And so this is one of the things that's kind of in your control. The next type is incidental. And so you don't have a previous intention of learning something, but after the experience, you know that there was some learning, okay? So, for example, touching a hot stove. You might not have intended to learn that thing was hot, but it's hot now after you touch it. Watching the news, so you didn't intend to, hear this news story about this surprising thing that happened in your state or whatever, but now you know. Scrolling through social media. This is really where a lot of social media kicks in, and that's why you have that never-ending scroll on social media. They're trying to keep your attention with this informal learning. And so you didn't necessarily want to see that awesome cat video when you scrolled through Facebook or whatever, but you did, and now you know that it happened. Okay, the last type is the most subtle type. Okay, it's called socialization. And that's the internalization of values, attitudes, behaviors, and skills that occur every single day. So how are we speaking language? So think about, how did you learn the language that you speak? So how did you learn the English language that I'm speaking right now? Like, how are you even able to understand what I'm saying? So language is a very socialization type of informal learning. What do we eat? What do we not eat? How are you to be polite? So people have different manners, like when you're sitting at a dinner table or whatever, how are you supposed to act in public? Those are the sort of things that are very subtle, that we don't even know that we're learning it, but we are. Okay, so just a real quick summary. The only one that's really intentional is the one that is self-directed. So if you had to, take it upon yourself to learn something on the internet, that was probably self-directed, and you're very aware of the experience at the time. Incidental is you not necessarily intentionally learning something, but you are aware of it. And then socialization, you did not necessarily want to learn it, and you weren't even aware that it happened. Okay, so that's a very important one to understand. Okay, so another important aspect of informal learning is learning through play. Remember how I said, a lot of people are like, oh, they're just playing, they're not learning, right? So that's a problem, because if we start to associate playing with having no educational value, then that might be an issue. Okay, there's a lot of value in play and games and things like that. There's actually a huge effort to gamify the learning process to make it more engaging. And so we have, for example, here different styles of, different ways that people can learn through play. We got fantasy, like have you ever seen those little kitchens that kids play with, or expressive, like a chalkboard, or painting things like finger painting, and so on. The other thing to consider now as we move on is, how do we leverage this informal learning now? So we know the difference between informal and formal. We know the types of informal now. How are we going to kind of leverage this in our life? I'm going to give you some personal examples and give you maybe a way to think about this in a more practical sense. Okay? So let's start with a review of kind of the learning process, right? So the way that we take in data from our environment is through our perception and our senses, right? So we have 5 senses that are able to gather data from our environment. That's kind of where we can start. So we have some environmental stimuli, and it's going to go into our sensory memory. Most of that is going to be lost. So most of the things that you hear, smell, taste, touch, see, you're not going to remember them. It's for a reason, right? I mean, you don't want to overload your brain, okay? So that happens in less than a second, usually. Then you can pay attention to things, like you're paying attention to my voice right now. I'm working on that working memory or your short-term memory. That's going to last less than a minute, but you can refresh it. So it has some sort of a 7-item capacity, but you can maintain that. That's kind of like where your consciousness is. And then you have your long-term memory, which could last a lifetime. And we have this constant retrieval and encoding between the short-term and the long-term memory. And we have different types of long-term memory. So you have the more conscious memories, like your experienced events and your knowledge and concepts. And then you have your more unconscious long-term memory, like your emotional conditioning or your, some of your skills and actions. So if you pull up on a dead animal in the middle of the street and you start to feel sad about that, that might have been some emotional conditioning from your long-term memory. And then so the whole point is that we can have some information retrieval from our working memory. That's kind of how the memory works, but I want you to understand that it all starts kind of with this idea of attention. So how do we leverage people's attention, and how can you manage your own attention? That's going to be an important theme as we move forward here. So I'll give you a real quick test, and we'll watch this video and we'll see how you do.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
All right. So, did anybody see the moonwalking bear the first time? I know I didn't, right? And even when I know it's there, when I'm trying to count those passes, I can't see it. And it's just crazy to think that your brain is just that limited, right? We can all have the same experience, but we can all have different things that we remember and we're paying attention to within that experience. So it's just a crazy lesson to be, to understand, is that your attention is very, very important. And it's very easy to leverage that attention. Notice how that video directed your attention to counting things, and then all of a sudden it directed your attention to looking for something like a moonwalking bear. And so we need to be aware that our attention is a little bit easier to manipulate than we might think. The other thing to think about is that these big life events draw a lot of attention, right? And so sometimes, these big changes can happen after them. So think about, the birth of a child, or getting married, or, somebody coming back from war, or maybe getting killed in war, or, somebody becoming an addict, or finally, recovering from being an addict. Because we know that addiction is like one of the #1 causes of death in the United States for people under 50. So we probably all know somebody or know of somebody that is addicted to something. And so we have debt, right? A lot of debt can ruin your life. It'll draw a lot of attention when you start paying that debt off. Or a medical emergency. Unfortunately, we're only one phone call away from a loved one being in serious trouble. And so that is obviously going to draw a lot of attention, and that is very important to understand, that attention is a key part of informal learning and what we remember. Okay, so think about this picture. This is a museum, and you can kind of see, based on this picture, what are they trying to get this kid or kids or whoever's visiting to pay attention to, right? Clearly he's walking on this thing that they have set up for him. And you can see how the whole environment is kind of set up around that. So it's encouraging, it's drawing his attention. So I want you to think about that theme that we're talking about of attention through all of these pictures. We look at here. Do you see how they have the little spots on the ground? So those are clearly drawing their attention to stand in those locations and to look at that TV screen, right? So how are we setting up our environment to draw attention? So here's another museum picture. There's a big screen set up, right? And that you can interact with this screen. It's got a menu. It's drawing people's attention. You have virtual reality that you can put on these goggles and just basically, step outside of humanity for a second and just be like, wow, you can experience, amazing things. And that'll clearly take over your attention. We have a picture here. If you are thinking about designing a kitchen, I mean, you can make a career out of designing things. And that has a lot to do with informal learning. And so think about if we change one element of this kitchen, let's say we're designing a kitchen, we could change one thing in this kitchen and make the entire feel of this kitchen different. You ready? Boom. Okay. Now, what draws your attention now? It should be the backsplash, right? Now I'll go back. So the backsplash of this kitchen kind of fades away, and the goal is not to have it be visually, right in your face. And then all of a sudden, boom, now we have contrast. So our brains are naturally wired to look for contrast and differences there. Okay, we look at this. Look at how plain this is in this museum. We have, your attention is clearly being drawn to we the people. The floor is very blank. I mean, they don't even have baseboards on the floor, on the walls. And so you can see how this layout here is clearly designed to focus people's attention to certain areas. So here's some other pictures from the museum. We can see how everything in the background kind of fades away and your attention is focused here. We can see the same thing here. Very plain. We are looking at things that stand out to us. We have a bunch of contrast. We have colors that our brain is naturally wired to look for. Again here. And then this one's a little bit more subtle. We have the same type of idea here, but I want you to pay attention to the doorway, okay? Now, this might not be something that you've thought of, but clearly at some point in time you had to learn what a door was and what it did, or what an opening was and what it does, and you can actually walk through that opening. So your eye is drawn to the opening there because you know that you can walk through it, right? And so that is done for a reason. We want to know where the openings are in the wall. We're basically pre-programmed. We've informally learned at some point what a door was, what an opening is, how to go through that. And so our brain is drawn to that opening. Okay, another one. Here is a advertisement from McDonald's, and they're using a couple things. Number one is they're using color. So notice how they chose the color red. Red is a color that the human brain naturally responds to a little bit more than other colors. So think about a red light or think about a stop sign. Why are they red? Okay. Also, think about the size here. Your brain is naturally going to look at the bigger text first. And so, crafted for your craving. That's what they want you to read. At the bottom, the wait is happening before they cook it. That's what they don't want you to read. That's what's called fine print. Okay, they don't want to draw your attention to that. The next thing is Netflix. What do you think they want you to feel here? They want you to feel that you're connected when you watch Netflix. They want you to feel like, you're snuggled up on the couch eating popcorn and it's a nice family time and whatever. They want you to feel a certain way as you look at this Netflix. Try it for 1 month. What about this? Why do you think they put names on these Cokes? Okay, clearly, again, it's to draw people's attention. The second you see your name, or for that matter, the second you see anybody's name that you recognize, you're probably more willing to buy that. So if I saw my friend's name, let's say Evan, on this Coke bottle, I would probably buy it just because, I think it'd be cool to give him a bottle that has his name on it. Especially if I saw my name on there, I would definitely buy it. Okay? They're trying to leverage people's attention. They know that people recognize their name and they respond and give attention to their name. Okay. Again, with the fine print, right? What do they want you to see? And what do they not want you to see? It's a little bit blurry, but the idea is they want you to think, 10% off on $125 or more purchase. They don't want you to see that as much. And then if you read all the fine print, you can find out that it's only valid Friday and Saturday and whatever, and you can't really use it unless you're at this store and whatever, right? And again, with the colors and how we dress, so this even goes into fashion, right? So if you're a fashion person, what are you going to dress like if you're dressing for an interview or just to go out in public? Do you want to draw attention to yourself based on what you're wearing? And so people do this all the time. But clearly you can see how this woman in the yellow is standing out from the crowd. This is a picture I took for research. Do you want your research to stand out, right? Because you can do all the research in the world, but none of it really means anything if you're not communicating that research with other people. Okay, so a big part of research is actually presenting your ideas to the world so that the world can benefit from your research, right? And so part of that is with research posters. So how are they attracting your attention to this research poster? I would have never, when I was walking down the hallway, have ever even given this poster the time of day if I didn't see what they were trying to do to focus my attention, which is, what the F block are we doing, right? And so on the periodic table, there's a part of the periodic table which is the F block, and that is kind of what they're doing. And so that drew my attention right there. So they were very clever when they did that. Another thing to think about with attention is lack of attention to things that matter in our life. Okay, so think about how phones and technology that really just came about in the past few decades are really dominating our attention compared to, let's say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. I mean, 1,000 years ago. They didn't have this. But now we have these devices that will feed us new information, and they're constantly feeding us dopamine to interact with them. And so it's quite depressing when you think about it. But these companies, these social media companies and whatnot, they are trying to basically sell your attention. So they make money off of advertisements, and their goal is to get you to interact with their platform for as long as possible. And so part of that is basically trying to create addicts out of you, whether they're doing it intentionally or not. And so that can lead to problems, for example, at this dinner table, where the meaningful things in your life are put to the side because you're on a dopamine high. Here, same thing. Your attention is being taken from you by these devices. We have countless accidents every day, and a lot of them are due to drivers that are distracted, or you can even look at the person walking in front of the car who is distracted. This idea of lack of attention for things that are important and attention towards things that aren't as important, it's a huge problem that we have to understand. We have to make sure we are in more control of our attention. Like we really, like at the metacognitive level, need to make sure that we are in control of our attention, and we're not letting our devices control us. Okay? And so a little bit of the science here with the dopamine, we remember the idea of a neuron communicating with another neuron through this synapse. And you can see these neurotransmitters, right? And one of the most important neurotransmitters that we need to talk about is dopamine. And so dopamine is right here. It's just a molecule, right? And it's just a collection of atoms bonded together. And it's responsible for feelings of pleasure and desire. So actually, more importantly, is desire. A lot of people say, oh, it's pleasure. It's actually desire too. So the things that you desire to do have to do with dopamine. All right? And so a couple things to think about there. Well, two things. One is homeostasis. So it's this idea that your body will naturally do things to maintain balance. Okay, so for example, if you're too cold, you're going to shiver. If you're too hot, you're going to sweat because you're trying to maintain body temperature. And another idea is tolerance. So if your body is used to having a lot of alcohol, for example, you will get a tolerance to that, and it won't affect you as much. So we need to apply these ideas to dopamine. And we have to understand that we are actually developing tolerance and dependence on this dopamine through these experiences that are just releasing so much dopamine. So one cure to this is that we can do a dopamine detox. And so what we can do is we can say, okay, we're going to have a certain period of the week, a certain period of the day, whatever. Okay, it's an important thing to have a schedule. And you are purposefully going to cut that time out of your life, and you're going to say, there's no internet, there's no phone, no computer, no music, no masturbation, no junk food, nothing that's going to release dopamine, stereotypically. And you can do things, though, like walking, meditating, reflecting, journaling, cleaning, okay? How many people are living in a mess right now where they could definitely have their environment around them a little bit more clean than it is right now, but nobody wants to do it? Right? But what you'll find is if you limit yourself from doing the dopamine things, that you actually might have some motivation to do the dishes and do some of those things that might not be as fun. And so what's happening is that you're starting to trick your brain into liking things that are actually hard things to do stereotypically. And so one thing that I recommend for you to do is try this idea of a dopamine detox. Okay? And so let's watch this short little video. We're going to get into some of my personal experiences with informal learning.
Education is not just about crossing a course off your list or getting a transcript or a degree at the end. At some point you'll realize that it means something more.
I was conducting research on discrimination of Muslim women in France, so I was really blessed my junior year to study abroad. I took that opportunity not only as a traveling opportunity, but a learning opportunity to conduct research for my thesis.
I came to UB as a painting major, and at first I wasn't even tackling art history. The trip to Crete was very inspiring. Seeing something that was 3,000 years old, holding that in your hand is so different to looking at it in a textbook.
University at Buffalo is looking to emphasize the way in which we can relate various different components of the undergraduate experience to one another. We want to show students how they can integrate their learning and see their education as a continuum rather than a series of discrete and separate experiences.
I was in Chemistry 101, and I would stay in this TA lab where the TAs would walk around and help all these students with their assignments. And after I was done with my homework, I would actually stay there and help other people. And I just realized that I loved teaching and tutoring, so ever since that point, I've gotten involved with as many teaching opportunities as I possibly could get involved with.
Starting my freshman year, I co-founded a club on campus called The Girl Effect. Our members are really who've inspired me, because they really are interested in coming together and learning about the issues that girls in developing countries are experiencing.
So I got to present a piece of work in response to my experience in Greece. I wanted to think about what archaeologists would find if they looked at our civilization and the way that we do things.
There are all kinds of ways in which the academic enterprise is complemented by so many different opportunities on campus. What UB is going to do now is to move into a way of formalizing integrative learning and foregrounding the philosophy of integrative learning as central to a UB undergraduate education.
I really believe that I had a well-rounded experience here with volunteering, internships, my majors, and my study abroad. It truly has propelled my agenda for what I want to do with my future career.
I think that now that I went to Greece and I had this experience, that took my artwork in a completely different direction.
When you find your calling and you become passionate about it, it really makes your college experience that much more exciting. And you invest in your own education. You're learning because you want to, not because you have to.
All right, so that was basically a message of there's things beyond your major, right? And so I was recruited to be one of the students in that video because I kind of went above and beyond what it meant to be a physics major or a chemistry major or a math major, right? There's more to class than, there's more to life than sitting in a classroom. And so what the universities are trying to do now, what the formal educational system is trying to do now, is actually incorporate more of the informal learning experiences, because we're starting to recognize how valuable these informal learning experiences actually are. I mean, think about what you're doing at EPICS, right? EPICS is a fairly informal structure that we've come up with. And so it's very student-centered. There's a lot of experiential learning and reflection built into that. And so this idea of formalizing informal learning has become quite popular. Now, another area, a couple examples from my life. I want you to start to think about some of the things that you could learn that you do not know, and that you're not going to school for. Okay, so I never went to school or got any formal training in construction. But as we go along here, you're going to understand that I actually was able to learn a lot about construction, though. All right, so let's talk about that. This is a picture of me in my bathroom. So I realized that my bathroom, in my house, my master bath, just needed to be done, right? It needed to be renovated. I had never renovated a bathroom before in my life, but there's so many online resources, so many forums and whatnot, that you can teach yourself practically anything nowadays. And so slowly but surely, I turned my bathroom into this, right? So completely redid the whole thing, custom tiled shower and everything. And every step of the way, I made sure I was doing it correctly because I was so, self-conscious about doing something wrong. Okay, we look at another example. This is what my kitchen looked like not too long ago. I had to tear it all apart because one of the pipes broke. You're going to have a lot of informal learning once you own a house, I'll tell you that. Okay, so you had a pipe that broke in the winter, and then I went to turn it on after the winter time, and it flooded the kitchen a little bit. And so after that, we were like, I grabbed every towel in the house and, dried it up as soon as I could, put the fans on, but it's prime time for mold at that point. And so we started smelling mold in our kitchen, and we realized that basically the whole kitchen had to be torn apart and had to be redone because all of this mold. And this is what it looks like, kind of what it looks like now. I've done some more things. But I had to redo the whole kitchen, okay? All the cabinets I painted, crown molding, island, I moved the pantry. I'd never done that before. I put in butcher block countertops there. I redid the stairs that you see there used to be carpeted. I had to do that as well. The floor is brand new, that hand-scraped, engineered hardwood flooring. I had never put that in before. And so a lot of informal learning there. One of the most recent big projects that I was able to tackle is a deck off of my house. I had never built a deck before, but my deck was getting pretty old, and so I went on the Menards website and started designing my deck with their software and getting an idea of what my deck could be, because I had a really small deck before, and I wanted to have a big deck that's 48 foot wide and 20 foot away from the house, like huge, right? And I wanted it to take up the whole back of my house because the back of my house is really slow. It's on a huge slope, and it's not really usable. And so now that I have a daughter, I wanted to let her outside and let her play, and in a safe environment without having to worry about, there's a pond in our backyard too. I didn't want to have to worry about drowning. I didn't want to have to worry about the slope or anything. So it's like a big playpen, right? And so I designed it, right? I got the measurements. I did some surveying. Remember, I had never done this before. And this is kind of how it turned out. So I've done some more stuff like put a gate in there. But the general idea is that is done now, right? I was able to do it. And it took about a month. I had my brother come help me. And we got it done. Another thing that happened recently that I'm in the process of learning right now is Arduinos. I don't know about you, but I don't know a lot of coding. I'm not very comfortable with Arduinos or Raspberry Pis or all these microcontroller stuff. Like, it's very intimidating to me. I've never done it. I never had it in my high school experience. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. And so there's tons of videos, and I'm actually creating a lesson now that involves a 3D printer, a laser engraver, and this Arduino, because I'm not afraid to tackle those challenges, because I know that I don't know it, but I know through neuroplasticity I can know it in the future. And there's a lot of resources nowadays to do this informally, even though I've never taken a computer science class in my life through my formal education or anything like that, engineering or whatever. Okay, another thing is gaming, right? We talked about the importance of play. So I used to play a game called World of Warcraft. It's one of the most popular computer games in existence. It had millions of players. You've probably heard of it. If you haven't, just quick Google. Anyway, the idea is that it's like this fantasy game where you run around and there's these monsters, and you group up and you have a guild of real people and you're trying to fight in these dungeons and whatnot. I had been playing this game since I was like 12 years old, right? And it was kind of like my escape. Part of my coping mechanism as a child was to just kind of escape into this virtual world. And And so eventually, I actually learned a lot of leadership skills in that game, because I became a guild master, and I had weekly events that we would schedule. And at one point in time, I think I was like 16 years old, and I was scheduling events for a lot of these people were like in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and I was leading them and guiding them through these dungeons and whatnot. And I was the guild master of like I think there was 1,000 people almost in our guild. And it's just crazy that I was able to have that sort of a leadership experience on a video game. And so this idea of esports is actually exploding, right? So when we think about sports, we usually think about football and whatever. Like, esports is huge, right? It's exploding. Look at all the people in that crowd, and they're all coming to watch people play video games, okay? It's a huge part of our future, is this idea of virtual reality and virtual entertainment and whatnot. Okay, another thing is, think about on YouTube how many just things that you could learn. These are all videos that I've watched. Crash course physics, crash course chemistry, crash course computer science, all those things. It's free, okay? Get on there before you go to bed, click on some videos and start learning. Doesn't even cost money. Stanford, Yale, Harvard, a lot of the Ivy League schools, they're gonna, MIT, they have open courseware where you can just go on, and I was able to watch a lot of the stuff that I've been presenting to you in this series. Some of it I learned from Robert Sapolsky, and he's from Stanford, and he's an expert in like neuroscience and human behavioral biology. I watched his whole 25 video course. You also have justice, so like if you wanted to be a judge or something, or learn about ethics, right? And from Harvard, it's a wonderful series that you should watch. What is the right thing to do, right? Another thing is epics. There's, again, a lot of informal learning that happens with epics. This is one of my first experiences with engineering as being a TA for epics. Last year really was my first formalized experience with engineering, and this is a lot of new learning for me. We were building this sensory wall for this daycare in one of my teams, which again is informal, right? They're interacting with these different textures here on the wall, and it's very important to have different textures and colors and whatnot for kids when they're younger as part of the learning process. We also think about spell check. I don't know how much learning actually happens because we're so reliant on it, but now we have so many tools nowadays where we can learn how to spell certain words and have these tools that will help check our work for us. Before we had to write something and turn it into a teacher and have them give us some feedback. Now we can use something like Grammarly or just the built-in spell check on Microsoft Word or whatever, and we can get a lot of feedback. Okay, think about also the social media platforms and how that can be a platform for informal learning. So this is an example from a group that I belong to called Physics Footnoters. Now this is a picture that I took in my classroom, and it's called White Light is Not So White, okay? Because when you split white light into its colors, it's actually all colors, right? So all of the colors of light combine together to be white light. And so that's a picture of me separating that white light back into Roy G. Biv. And so, notice how it has, at the time, it had 11 comments, it had 45 likes or whatever. So this is a way in which we can start to teach each other and have discussions on these social platforms. I was able to teach and learn from people that I had never met, and I probably will never meet in person. Also, think about how much we learn informally about products when we go to shop, like on Amazon, for example, and we're always looking for those 5-star reviews, and then for me, I always look at the critical reviews, right? And I'm trying to learn as much as I can about that product before I buy it, okay? But you got to be careful because there's a lot of companies now that will do some shady things, and they'll basically have a bunch of fake reviews on there, and you'll be able to tell because a lot of times they're only going to be a few words like, oh, this product's great, right? And there's just a bunch of bots going in there and doing the customer reviews. So you got to be careful. But again, that's because they know that people look at this as part of informal learning. Also, music, books, culture, right? So think about how much you've learned from books. For me, unfortunately, it hasn't been a lot because I'm not a big reader. And that's one of the things that was kind of stolen from me as a kid is a joy of reading. There's so much knowledge that can be gotten from books. I'm more of like a video type of person. I will watch every video on YouTube on a particular topic. That's how I kind of learn informally. But It's also the idea of culture, remember, like our values, our traditions. Remember the boy who cried wolf, right? So there's a lot of, if you go back and read a lot of the kids' books, like you'll find that there was actually some very deep messages going on in that book that you probably never got as a kid. Think about the traditions like Christmas. Think about the music, right? There's a lot of learning that can be done through music. Musicians are brilliant, some of them, in the way that they can actually focus people's attention on certain issues through their music, right? So think about one of my favorite songs is 100 Years to Live by Five for Fighting. And the whole point of that song is when you only got 100 years to live, right? The whole point is to recognize that we have a limited time on this earth. It's actually my ringtone, right? So every time my phone rings, I actually realize that my time here on this earth is limited. So how do I want to live my life today? Knowing that, I don't want to go to my deathbed and have regrets. Okay. The next thing would be mentors. So we're wrapping this up now. It's very important. Remember that statistic that it said, a huge proportion of self-made, millionaires can point to some sort of a mentor that was able to help them, right? So a lot of informal learning is done by finding somebody who is where you want to be, like 10 years from now. So figure out where you want to be, find somebody who's already there or who is already, kind of there in a similar position, and then try to recruit them to be your mentor. So for me, it's Lynn Bryant is one of my mentors. Keep in mind, it doesn't just have to be one, okay? I have mentors for a lot of different things in my life. But in terms of academics and my PhD, she is my mentor. And so I gain a lot from her because she's already gone through a lot of the experiences that I'm going to be going through. And so find somebody like that. It's invaluable. Okay. And we got one more video here and then we'll kind of wrap it up. Okay. So lifelong learning is really where we're going with this, right? What is the importance of this idea of informal learning and lifelong learning? Because that's really what the formal educational system is supposed to be teaching us. It's supposed to be teaching us how to think and how to become lifelong learners and giving us a foundation for that. So let's think about how important that is for today's society.
Our world is undergoing fundamental and disruptive change, technological, organizational, demographic, climatic, presenting new challenges to the future of work. These global megatrends are having a profound impact on skills. Many of today's skills won't match tomorrow's jobs, and skills acquired today may quickly become obsolete. The concept of lifelong learning has been around for decades, and the ILO has adopted numerous normative instruments and policies related to lifelong learning. But the unprecedented transformation underway is redefining its terms and giving it new importance.
In the old days, we could say, let's go to school, get qualified for a job, enter the labour market, and that's the job of learning done. We need people to learn how to learn because learning is going to be a feature of the transitions they're going to go through throughout their lives.
Lifelong learning affects us all. It is central to managing the transitions we face over the life cycle, from early childhood and basic education to adult learning and upskilling and reskilling to take advantage of change. It is a global concept applying to developed and developing economies. And it requires the active engagement and support of governments, employers, and workers. How do we adapt lifelong learning to our new reality? There's no one-size-fits-all strategy, but there are things we can do. Develop foundational and core work skills. Coherent and affordable financial and non-financial incentives. Improve vocational guidance and labor market data. Recognize both formal and informal skills learning. Improve coordination. And ensure equitable access to learning. Today, there is renewed interest in lifelong learning. It's a major goal of the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development. and the Global Commission on the Future of Work has called for formal recognition of an entitlement to lifelong learning. Ultimately, lifelong learning is the key for people to be able to benefit from new ways of working, and it will light the path on our journey to a brighter future of work.
All right, so yeah, think about as we move on into the future and the jobs that are going to be available, right? So think about a couple things like self-driving cars and the types of jobs that are going to be impacted by self-driving cars, and also other forms of artificial intelligence. Basically, it's this idea that society is rapidly growing, and you've heard of Moore's law with the amount of transistors that we can fit. Is basically doubling every 2 years. And so as we think about, the future, we have to understand that we're probably preparing people for jobs that don't even exist yet. And so we need to make sure that we're not teaching like the old days, like in the video. In the olden days, we could just teach you a certain set of skills and boom, you're done. This new society that we're setting up is going to require as a feature this idea of learning and informal learning. And so it's very, very important as we move forward with all of these technological changes that we're facing. Okay, so real quick summary. Lifelong learning is more important than ever before in today's society. Formal education needs to focus on how to learn and think, right? How are we going to build a strong foundation for lifelong learning? That needs to be the focus of formal education. We need to understand that formal and informal learning exist in a spectrum, right? And they should drive each other. We also want to understand that this power of informal learning is just immense, and we need to be aware of our environment. And certain things in our environment can spark our curiosity and imagination. It could be explicit or implicit things. We can maintain our social environment and learning community. So relationships are going to be a big part of informal learning. Remember, mentors. And we also want to make sure we're fostering experiences that are connecting our informal and our formal learning together. So try to make sure that you're making that bridge in your life. Remember, we talked about dopamine detox to help reset your reward system so that you can enjoy and learn to do some of the more difficult things in your life. We talked about this idea where we can learn informally, right? And one of the main things that you can do is learning from your own mistakes. But more importantly, learning from other people's mistakes, because if you learn from other people's mistakes, then you don't even have to make the mistake. That's the cool part. There's an awesome quote from Abraham Lincoln that I like, and it says, "I learn something from everyone I meet. From most people, I learn what not to do." Okay, so even if you're in the presence of somebody that you feel like you're not going to learn something from them, you always have to treat every interaction with another human being like they know something that you do not know, because it's true. Okay, somebody, no matter who it is that you're talking to, they're going to know something that you don't. And so looking for those golden nuggets are important. And even if it's learning what not to do, okay, learn from their mistakes. So that's going to be important. It's a huge part of informal learning. And then the last thing is don't limit yourself and try to learn something new every day. All right? So let's get into our discussion. So here's 4 questions that I want you to think about. Question number 1, so think about all of them, and then you can kind of address any question. You can address all the questions if you want, or just address one of them. But think about all these questions. What is one informal learning experience that you have had, that you can identify, okay, that you've already had? And then what is one that you will pursue? So hopefully I've motivated you, and this presentation has motivated you to pursue some sort of informal learning experience that you've been putting off. You want to learn more about what? X, Y, Z. The next question is, how does your formal learning connect to your informal learning? Do you see that connection? Do you purposely try to make those connections? And then lastly, but not least, would be how can you leverage informal learning in your life and at Epics? Okay, so anybody willing to share? You could just raise your hand or start speaking.
Okay. I think probably the first one that comes to mind when I asked about like what formal learning experiences I had was kind of like we were talking about earlier. My dad was really into like construction type of stuff, so like steaming wallpaper, you know, putting backsplash on the kitchen on that kind of stuff. So it kind of helped me with that. But I guess I never really thought of it as like, oh, I'm actively doing something. But now that I look back, I have experience with that kind of stuff. So even if I couldn't do it by myself, it's kind of effective, like watching a video.
Absolutely. So thank you for sharing. So you addressed the first question. What is one informal learning experience that you've had? Can somebody else share?
I can go ahead and share.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that I love doing the most is going to parks, either small or large, local, state, national, whatever. And so the Creative Park Project is the project that I'm on. And so something that I always do every time I go to a park is I try and look at how it's organized, what structures they have, how they're trying to teach people using it, the signage especially, because like I enjoy it, but it also allows me to look and see what we can do with the Creative Park Project. So I've done that a lot, both locally around Lafayette. Over the summer, I went to a lot of parks and looked around. And it's helped me to think about the design of the park a lot.
Yeah, that's good. And you know what, that makes me think of somebody who was starting a business and wanted to make sure it was successful. And they went around to all the competitors, all the other, stores in the area. They got on their hands and knees and were crawling, looking at every aspect of what do they have that I don't have? What am I missing? What can I incorporate? What can I learn from my competitors? And now we have Walmart. Okay, so that's how Walmart was started. And think about how successful Walmart has been. And that's how it started, is just really taking their competitors seriously and literally crawling on the floor and stuff like that of their competitors to learn more about how they can do better. And so if you look at a lot of the most successful businesses, that's the sort of attitude that they have. Okay, let's have someone share on how can you leverage informal learning in your life and at Epics. So we've mainly addressed kind of the first question where we're talking about, what is an informal learning experiences that you've had. But what is one that you want to pursue? And what is one that, you think that you can leverage in your life? How can you leverage this informal learning in your life and at Epics in particular? We heard about the Creative Park, and that is kind of addressing that a little bit, because as you go to parks, you can start to think about how you want to take some of those things and put it into the park that you're designing. But let's hear at least one more person on that.
I can share. So I'm design lead for my sub team in Epics. So we're not necessarily like taught how to lead the team or like what to do. You kind of just figure it out. And being an engineer, that's something that I'm definitely going to have to do, later on in my career, like lead a group and just have those leadership skills. So those things that I'm learning in Epics and like that I'm applying to my project are also going to be really valuable to have like in the real world as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a lot of different things that you can learn informally about leadership as well. Through your interactions at Epics, but also through some videos and TED Talks and things like that. There's a lot of different leadership videos that are out there from, top leaders in the country. So find a leader that you really respect and resonate. I mean, it could be Jeff Bezos at Amazon. It could be whoever you kind of think is a good leader, and then start to study what is it about that person that makes them a good leader, and how can I maybe adopt some of those things. So good. Alrighty. Well, hopefully you've all learned something about how informal learning can impact your life and how you can start to leverage informal learning in your life. I know that a lot of times before bed I will just watch videos on some intellectual topic, and sometimes I actually fall asleep as I'm watching it. But it really gets me thinking intellectually to the point where my brain just can't handle it anymore, and then I just fall asleep. But I guess the point is, how much are you actively trying to learn in your life? Okay, it's not a question you have to answer right now to me, but ask it to yourself. How much do you go out of your way every day to learn something new? And hopefully you will strive a little bit, harder. You'll try a little bit harder to learn something new now every day with all of the resources. You have more resources today than any other generation has had to learn new things. And so embrace that and use it to empower yourself as you move through life and achieve your goals. So have a wonderful rest of your night, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Graham.
The human development is the next part of the series coming up on 11:30. So if you're interested in human development, then I will see you then. All right.
Thank you.
Yep.